What's up, everybody? It's Mr. Pfaffengut. Welcome back. I hope you had a fantastic break. Today we are going to be beginning a new unit, Unit 5, Jacksonian Era, so make sure that you make a marker in your spiral for that. And then, obviously, there's going to be, as usual, opportunity for you to answer some things, think about stuff, jot down your answers in your spiral. So just make sure that you pause as necessary for those things. I'm not going to obviously make a super long video, hopefully. So make sure that you answer this in your spiral, right? What kind of qualities you want in a president. And then also you're going to be answering this same question on Edpuzzle as well. And again, please, it's not about Trump. It's not that. Like, you're going to be voting, probably some of you, in the next election. So these are things you should be thinking about, right? Like, what are the actual qualifications and experience you think a president ought to have? Okay. And then some more things to consider. What makes a good president? At the end of this, we'll be talking about whether or not Jackson was a good president or not. So this is something else that you ought to consider, not just what are the qualifications, that sort of thing, but once the president's term is over, how do you judge it, right? Do you judge it based on just the fact that they indeed had those qualifications and things that you talked about in the last question? Or is it something else? Maybe things like following through on campaign promises, what their impact on their policies impact was on the economy, that sort of thing. Those are important things to consider. And so take a moment, pause here, and think about these things, answer them, jot them down. They will come back later when we get to the end of the unit. For Jackson, there's really one thing we have to do: explain the impact of the election of Andrew Jackson. There's a couple other of specific objectives that we will have, but that's the big thing. What's the impact of the election of Jackson? And for all of the unit, regardless of whether objectives change or not, we will need to be asking, why was his election and presidency so significant, right? So we had the early republic, and we have 5 presidents in the early republic: Washington and Adams and Jefferson, right? Like these big names, right? So why does Jackson get a unit all to himself? Maybe if you think about it in those terms, right? Like, what is so significant about his election and presidency? Okay, so something to keep in mind as we go along, not just today, but through the unit. Today we're going to learn a strategy that you are pretty likely to see when you get into high school classes, especially if you're doing AP. There's different things that work like this for analyzing images, but I like this one. It is called optic. So write this down in your spiral. Pause here, obviously, right? Because you are going to do a few of these. We're not going to go crazy with it, but you will see this a few times this year. So you'll want to have a place to come back to it. Even if you want to go to put this down in the very, not the very last page, because that's where you have your important dates and stuff, but towards the back of your spiral, that sort of thing, so that you have a place you can flip to and you know for sure where it is. You do it there as well, or just keep it here and know that it's back in Jackson. Okay. So pause, write these things down. One thing that y'all have a tendency to do when you're looking at images is, just point out the obvious. There's a horse. There's a tree. Okay, great, right? When we're analyzing images, we're not interested in simply saying, what do I see? But we want to ask, what does it mean? What does it tell us? How does it help us understand a historical event? How does it help us understand the creator's purpose? That sort of thing, right? We want to be digging deeper into it. Obviously, you will be looking at those things, and hence this part here, parts, right? The details. What are the things that you see? But then take that beyond that. How does it help you understand what's going on, right? So instead of, well, I see these things, I see this, maybe because, right? Like, so think of it that way, okay? So overview is really just when you think about the whole thing, right? What do you see is happening, right? So like if you had a picture of a bunch of people at the beach and there's people swimming, or whatever, right? You would just be like, overview. It's a day at the beach or something like that, right? Just big picture. What is it? Then you start looking into the details. Is there more going on, right? That sort of thing. If there is a title, how does it help you? And then the interrelationships. How are the parts, the details and things, and the title, and I say you gave because you will create your own if there is no title. How do they work together to create the overall idea, create a theme, or at least what you think may be the theme, that sort of thing. Okay, and then conclusion, this is where you make a claim about the image and defend it with evidence. Okay. Key point, defend it with evidence. All right, so make sure you have all that all written down. Okay, here's your first image, Washington's second inaugural ball. So we are in Philadelphia. Okay, so you're going to take a look at this image and you are going to take the overview. All right, so we know what the title is, all right, but if we're just looking at it, it's like, oh, it's a crowd of people outside of a fancy building. Like that could legitimately be your overview. Because the overview is not intended to be something that you do after you've really dug deep into it. It's supposed to be first glance, what do I see, right? Well, it's a whole bunch of people outside of a building. Maybe you would even say a bunch of fancy dressed people or something like that. But that's about as far as you would want to go with that. So you should look at answering the overview portion like in 15 seconds of looking at it or less. 10 is really probably, count to 10. What's your overview? So write your overview, excuse me, in your spiral, and then you would move on to parts. All right. And that's where we'll start to dig into details. Okay. So again, not, oh, there's a horse and carriage, but what about the horse and carriage, right? Is it just any old ordinary horse and carriage? Is it fancy? Is it, right? Whose is it? Okay, so ask yourself those sorts of things, not just I see it, but I see it, what does it mean? How does it help me understand the whole thing that we have going on here? Okay, right? Not just I see Washington, right? But what about Washington? What's happening around him? What are the other details around him that you have going on? By the way, that's Adams, that's Jefferson. Does that make sense? So, I don't know why I'm asking you. This is a video. So, right, not just, why do I see Washington, but how does the way he's positioned in the image, all those sorts of things, what kind of thing does it convey? Is he coming or going, right? Based on the way he's positioned, is he getting out of the carriage and entering the building or vice versa, right? Like it tells you all of those things by looking at it. So when you're doing parts, make sure that you're pausing and really thinking about those sorts of things. Okay. So take some time, do your parts. All right. And then of course we have a title. How does the title help to explain or give some help to you in understanding what's going on? Obviously, some titles will not be as straightforward as this if you're looking at an art piece or whatever potentially, but this one's pretty simple. And then in a relationship between those parts and the title, how do they work together to create meaning, etc., and your conclusion. Okay, here's our second one. You're going to do the same thing here. So again, like 10 seconds tops, and you're going to give your assessment of what is the overview, just big picture, what's happening, right? So basically in the time it took for me to say that, you should have already created that. Okay. So do that for this, all of the things for Optic. This is Jackson, in case let's not say, in your overview, you might say there's a guy standing on a wagon or whatever. But as we get into it, yes, this is Jackson, crowd of people. All right. So, and this is a postman, right? So he's on the mail carriage, essentially. Okay. So there you go. I won't say anything more about that. Work your optic and write down your answers in your spiral. I'll also provide a place for you to answer some things in Edpuzzle. Okay, so this will be just in your spiral. You can Venn diagram it or write a paragraph, of comparison between the two, right? And remember, the definition of compare is to note similarities and differences. So this is not just how they are similar, but also how they are different, because that's what to compare means. So when Miss Johnston says compare and contrast, she's being redundant. And I say this all the time, but feel free to tell her. Okay, so some info on Jackson. You'll definitely need this as notes, okay? But pause here a moment, write your notes, look it over, think about it, because there's going to be some questions following. Which group of people, and by that I mean those previous groups of people, right? The group around Washington, the group that's around Jackson in those two different images, would elect someone like Jackson, based on what we've looked at, that description of him you saw already, etc., and maybe these images here. Here is a great quote from Jefferson on Jackson. I will not read it to you, but you should absolutely pause and read it. All right. So something important happens prior to Jackson's election. All right, and that has to do with voting. So when the United States begins, late 1700s, who can vote and who would not have been able to vote? Specific groups, not just everyone else. Okay. That would be wealthy white males who owned land or property, right? They were propertied. Obviously, they also tended to be well educated. But as long as you were a white man and you had property, a specific amount, you could vote in the early days, in the colonial period as well as in the much of the early republic. So hopefully earlier you said that the regular folks in the second image would vote for Jackson, but the wealthier people around Washington would not have. So if they wouldn't have voted for Jackson, something must have happened in order for Jackson to be elected. What might that be? Suffrage had to expand. Suffrage just means the right to vote. It does not have anything to do with suffering despite starting the same. Suffrage equals right to vote. Okay? So prior to Jackson, suffrage had expanded. He does not do it. Suffrage expands prior to Jackson, which enables him to be elected. Okay? So during that early republic period, little by little, state by state, those laws are changing about who can vote. By the time that he is running, what that will mean is suffrage has expanded to all white males. Okay? No more property requirements. Are you a white male and a citizen, obviously, then you can vote. Okay? For Jackson's time period, we are going to call this the common man. That's an important phrase. So when you, as we move along, are talking about this or writing about this or whatever, and you use or you think about this stuff, we want to say not just all white males anymore. We want to say the common man, because that's the sort of thinking you want to be in regarding Jackson. Okay? So answer this question, obviously. Okay, so after Jackson, we would have scenes like this on Election Day versus the one we saw with Washington. I'll let you pause and look at that for a moment. Okay, 270 to win, fantastic website. This is the one for 1828 when Jackson wins, but you can look at them for all. So these are the states in blue that went Jackson, and here's a map of population. So that goes back to that question about where would they live? Rural areas, not big cities. Okay, the rest of this is vocabulary, terms, definitions, etc. You are going to want to go through and write them down from the PowerPoint